Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest.
Today, we welcome Aoife O'Brien, who is the founder of Happier at Work. She has over 20 years of experience at global companies like Unilever, Mars, Coca Cola and Kraft Heinz. And Aoife excels in data-driven problem solving to really boost productivity and engagement. She supports HR and business leaders in medium-sized organisations, focusing on creating environments where employees can really thrive. And she's got a particular professional interest in imposter syndrome. And we'll definitely be talking to her more about that in a little while. She is also the host of the hugely popular and highly acclaimed Happier at Work podcast. She holds an MSc in Work and Organisational Behaviour, and she's a member of the CIPD. Join us as she shares her insights on fostering happier workplaces. So tell us, Aoife, how were you first drawn to happiness in the workplace?
Do you know what, Nia? So there's two organisations that stand out to me that I worked in previously that really encapsulate what it means to be happier at work. And I think I took it for granted. You know, when you work somewhere and you just don't realise how good it is until you work somewhere else. Yeah. And you're like, oh, it was actually really good in that last place that I left. Okay. So I worked in two organisations and they were particularly good at the culture piece, at the inclusion piece, and really, really enjoyed working in both of those very different organisations, I must say. One was in the UK, one was in Australia, doing something completely different out of my comfort zone. And then I experienced two organisations that one was just toxic, and there's no other way to describe it. It had around 50% staff turnover and very misogynistic, toxic, old boys club type of culture. And another one where it was a global organization and we were the kind of small part of a global organization. And I just didn't feel like I was thriving in any of the roles that I had there. And so I suppose all of that together caused me to question myself, my abilities, what I want, what I'm good at. And ultimately, I left my corporate career. That's around 6 and a bit years ago now. And I went on and I studied coaching and I started my master's, as you mentioned, the master's in organisational behaviour. And it was during that master's that I asked these important questions. And I said, why was I not happy at work? And I explained to the lecturer, like, this is what happened. And she said, that sounds like a fit issue. So I became obsessed with this idea of fit and what it means to fit in at work and what it means to belong. And I did my article or my paper on that. And then I did my dissertation on this concept of fit. And I didn't tire, and I still haven't tired of that entire concept. And so that's kind of what brought me on this journey. And I suppose for me, that's what it meant to be happy at work. So I took all of the research that I did and I said, right, this is the research. These are some additional things that I've become aware of. And I've put together this framework that explains what happiness at work actually is.
Oh, amazing. Are you finding that other people are talking to you about this? I suppose it's quite a shock to the system when you are in an organisation that operates in one way and then you move into another organisation, you think, oh gosh, this really is different.
Yeah.
Are you finding people are talking about that?
I think there's a couple of different ways that you can look at that. So the first way, I think, is that all organizations are slightly different. And if you join a new organization, you still have, for want of a better word, a hangover from how things were done in the last organization. You're bringing that with you into this new place, into this new role. You know how to do things a little bit differently. You're trying to find your feet with the systems and the processes and the people, all of that kind of thing. So that's kind of one way to think about it. That's always going to happen because it's always going to be a little bit different. You'll feel a little bit like Bambi in the headlights where you're like, I have no idea what's going on here until you get to grips with it. However long that takes, it could take 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year. But then there's the other side where it's like, I went from this amazingly positive culture into And it took me a while to put my finger on it. It took me a while to be like, this is actually toxic. And I probably didn't even have the language at that time. It's only looking back. But it took me about 2 months to be like, something's not right here. Something's going on. I do see other people talking about that, but more from a personal perspective, or also, and on my podcast as well, we talked about the onboarding process and how important that is. Rather than just letting people sink or swim, how do you have a proper process in place so that they understand what their new role is and why they were brought in and all of those wonderful things. So I think on a personal level, hearing people's stories of moving roles, going from somewhere that you thought was okay to somewhere that was terrible, and then on to somewhere else that is amazing, but maybe you have a challenge with a particular individual in the organization as well.
Yeah, that resonates the way you've described that. And it's a shock to the system. I think if you worked in a bad organization and you go to good, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
But if you've been in a good one and all of a sudden you step into a bad one and you hadn't realized that this was a thing, that can be a real shock to the system. I
think that's the problem, that when you have it good, you don't realize and you completely and utterly take it for granted. Like I thought this is how work is. It was always a positive experience. I was always rewarded. I was recognized. I really enjoyed what I did. I really liked my colleagues. And then you go somewhere where you're like, this is really not the place for me. And it can be driven by one thing or another. You know, from the research I did, I focused on this idea of environment and the person and how they are in that environment. But there are other aspects to it as well, like your direct supervisor or the role itself. There are different aspects that impact on our experience of work. And me being the total data and research nerd, maybe that's something I'll look into in the future and add another element to the model as well. But I think it's really interesting to consider. But I think from an individual perspective and from an understanding yourself perspective, if you're going through that, where you're having a tough time, where you're not enjoying work, ask why. Why is that? What is at the root cause? It's not just that everything is terrible. There must be one thing that you can isolate, that you can understand a little bit better. And hopefully the Happier at Work framework gives a little bit of insight into what those things could potentially be.
That's a really good segue into asking you, what does self-awareness mean for you? Because what you've just described is that you have to have a level of self-awareness to be able to work out what it means for you, what an organizational fit is. So what does self-awareness mean to you?
I love how you've articulated that. So for me, self-awareness has always been this idea of understanding yourself, the impact that the environment has on you, but also equally the impact that you have on the environment. And when I say the environment, I mean the people around you. I mean other people. However, having had you on my podcast, I have now a deeper understanding of it. And I love your 3-layered approach, this idea that it's not just about understanding ourselves and understanding the impact. It's about having that reflective practice and changing our behavior as a result of how we are showing up or how we're being perceived in the world. And I hope I haven't butchered it, but I suppose it's just deepened my understanding of what that means. It's one thing to know yourself, but it's another thing to manage yourself or to take action based on the knowledge that you gain about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Those layers for me are fundamental, because I think self-awareness is not just about knowing yourself, because that's just introspection for me. It's about all of the other viewpoints and perspectives that other people bring to yourself. Because if you think you're one thing and the 20 people that you spend your most time with think you're something else, then you're probably that thing. So I think that it's a real good moderator. You talk to us about your Happier at Work framework. What is it? How can it help people? What is its structure? What is its purpose?
Yeah. So for me, it all comes from the research that I did, and I won't go too academic on it because I know, not everyone loves that. Like, I love it. I imagine you love nerding out on those academic type of things as well. But for me, it boils down to 3 pillars. So what came out of the research I did was the importance of values and understanding the alignment between the values of an organization and the values of an individual. And I'll go into these in a bit more detail once I've explained the model. And the next was about need satisfaction. And that was an eye opener for me because I was like, needs at work? Who has needs at work? And again, I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And then the third element, from an academic perspective, they talk about demands and abilities and your ability to meet the demands of the role. That was the least important factor. But I've kind of switched that to talking about strengths and whether or not you're getting to use the strengths that you have at work. So if you imagine they're the 3 pillars, but that needs to be underpinned by psychological safety at work, because you have to feel free to be able to express yourself, to feel safe in the environment, to try, to fail, all of those things. And then it's overpinned by this idea of leadership and having effective leadership in place to execute on those 3 pillars. So I'll talk one by one across the pillars. So the first idea, that the values and the importance of values, I mean, in relation to self-awareness, it's knowing what your own values are. Knowing, first of all, that you have core values as an individual, because I certainly didn't know that. I knew that our company had corporate values. I knew that those corporate values had nothing to do with my day-to-day experience at work. And the example I like to use is that one of the core values was simple, and it was the most bureaucratic organization I had ever worked in. So there's a total mismatch there. And it really drives a lack of trust in leadership if they're talking about these things like, oh, simple, and these are our values. And so the first thing I would say about values is, as an individual, understand what your core values are. And that's not an easy process, and it's not a quick process. It will take time, and it will take an investment of introspection to understand, well, what is it that's really important to me? Some things I find that really help are looking at what are the behaviors that you really detest in other people. So are there particular things that really bother you about, and I mean it about their behavior, how they show up in the world. And that might give you an inclination as to what is important to you. So if someone shows up being really boastful and bragging, then maybe humility is something that's actually quite important to you, and that's a core value of yours. From an organizational perspective, then, it's about having clearly defined values. Not every organization does. So have those clearly defined, because if you don't have them, you do have a culture and it is being impacted. It's just not controlled in any way by you. It's kind of a free for all. So have a really clear definition of what those values are. Make sure that that is the lived experience of the people in the organization as well. So that is the values piece. It needs that.
Yes. That you're talking about this. I was talking to my colleagues about this yesterday, and we said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's exactly it.
Yeah, totally. You have to have that in place, because if you don't, then it's just kind of, it goes willy-nilly. And if there's a mismatch, or if you're saying one thing but behaving in a completely different way, then it really erodes trust in the organization as well. So the second element is the need satisfaction piece. And I did my research particularly on this self-determination theory, which is, it has 3 elements of motivation from a need satisfaction perspective. So those 3 elements are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. Autonomy being a sense of choice and control over what you do and how you do it. Relatedness, then, I associate with, like, how do you get along with other people? Do you relate well to the other people on your team, in the organization? But also, how do you relate what you do on a day-to-day basis with the bigger picture of what the team, the department, the organization is trying to achieve? And also, how do you relate what you do on a day-to-day basis in the bigger, grander scheme of your life? Can you make a connection between what you're doing at work and what you want from your life, essentially? And then competence is the third one. And this is an idea of feeling capable of doing your role, which is why feedback is so important. And when you have too much competence, you might feel like you're bored or you're not challenged enough. So it's really important to have a degree of challenge with that. You're not just doing stuff you can already do, but you have a sense of challenge in the day-to-day work that you're doing. And then if you have too little competence, maybe you feel like an imposter. You could feel total imposter syndrome with what you're doing. So those are universal needs. Everybody has them. And in the same way that we have that kind of, you have to get the balance right with competence. If you think about autonomy, and during the pandemic, it was like suddenly overnight, we all had all of this autonomy, and some people didn't know what to do with that. So again, with autonomy, it's about finding the balance. You need to give people sufficient direction and guidance on the one hand, but also step back and let them figure things out for themselves. So too little autonomy and you're micromanaging, or you're being micromanaged, and too much autonomy and you're flailing and floundering because you lack direction. You don't know what you're supposed to be doing. You don't have clear expectations. So that's all around need satisfaction. Those are the three universal needs that we all have. But of course, as with everything, we have unique needs as well. So someone might have a need for status or power. Someone might have a need for a higher purpose that they're serving. There's lots of different needs that people might have. The thing with needs is you may not know that you have needs, or where they're being satisfied and met, or whether they're not being met. But you will know when you're feeling really frustrated. What frustrates you at work at the moment? Are you feeling like you're being micromanaged? Then you don't have enough autonomy. And if you feel like, oh, I could do this job with my eyes closed, you need that greater sense of challenge. So understanding what the driving frustration is for you at work is key to making sure that your needs get met. And when your needs are met at work and you feel satisfied, that's a driver of feeling a greater sense of connection and that you belong and that your values are aligned with the values of the organisation.
I'm thinking many years ago, I did a little bit of training on person-centered planning. And the question is, what do you want and what do you need? And it's a one-page profile that you develop. And I think when you're new in an organisation, it's a great tool to introduce yourself and introduce others to you. And this idea of what I want versus what I need, it's really quite difficult.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's I need to be fed by 12:30 lunchtime, because after that, it just goes downhill. But those kind of things, you really do have to think about them, don't you?
Yeah, you do, because I think we don't automatically know, because we don't talk about these things at work. I certainly never knew that I had needs at work. Interestingly, these things can be applied in your personal life as well, where you feel frustrated. But coming back to the workplace, we need to just get it out in the open and talk about that. And I love the idea of having a one-pager. What do I want? What do I need? And really thinking about what that is. You might struggle with what that is, but I'm hoping that this gives a sort of a framework, at least hitting those top three, the autonomy, relatedness, and competence bits, hopefully goes a long way to thinking about, okay, so where are my needs not being met and what do I need? I need challenge and I need direction, but I also need the freedom to figure things out and to make mistakes, and that's okay. So I think thinking about what it is that you need at a deep down level, and making sure that those needs are satisfied, and having those sometimes difficult conversations with people about what those needs are and how to get the needs satisfied as well.
Yeah, definitely. And your third pillar?
My third pillar is about strengths. So that is, I've kind of changed the language on it, because from an academic perspective, it's the area that we focus most on. If you think of a job ad, if you think of someone advertising a job or even an internal role, they lead with, these are all of the things that we require of you. And we don't really talk about the strengths that someone needs to have to fulfill that role. And we don't talk about the culture. We don't talk about the values. We don't talk about how you will be satisfied and rewarded in this role. So I'm putting it as my third pillar because it's the least important factor. I'm changing the language to strengths because this demands abilities thing, like I said, is the least important factor. But I think strengths is actually really important. Understanding what your strengths are. Do you know? Can you honestly say to yourself that you know what your strengths are? Do you have open conversations with your team about each other's strengths? I know we certainly didn't when I worked in a corporate environment. Do you know what each other's strengths are and do you openly talk about those? Can you pair people who have complementary strengths? So maybe one person is a visionary, big picture thinker and another person is more detail oriented and can outline the steps to get there, or it can challenge this big picture airy fairy thinking and rein them in a little bit. Yeah. And they would be a good pair to work together. So the strengths piece is really about understanding yourself better. So maybe this is where the self-awareness piece comes in, understanding more about yourself and your strengths, what you bring to the table. Maybe when you use, this is something that's come up in conversation recently as well, when you use your strengths too much, then how does that hinder you? Because we can use our strengths too much and then it becomes a weakness as well. So I think having that feedback and having that loop going on for yourself to continuously understand yourself and how you're showing up and how you can improve.
So with all of that in mind, your 3 pillars, for you, what does a happier workplace or a happy workplace look like, feel like, sound like?
I think that it's different for every single individual. And so if you think of it from the perspective of the framework, there could be some things that are more important to some people than others. For me personally, I really like challenge and a sense of belonging. Like that is what I really need to thrive. I want to feel like I fit in and I belong and I want to feel like I'm having an impact on the world and I can see what that impact is. So that is the relatedness piece. Like I want to see a direct relationship between the work that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis and the impact on the end user, the end client, the internal client, whoever that might be. So for me, it's the impact piece, the sense of belonging and the challenge. And by challenge, I mean, I'm getting to use my strengths and I'm getting to stretch myself.
You also talk to us about your interest or your particular focus on data. So if we think about what you need in a happy workplace and your interest in data and detail, how does all of that come together to support you or drive the work that you do now?
Really great question. So a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, I took this quiz called the Sparky type. It's spelt how you might think. So Spark and then with an E, Sparky type. And in it, there's 10 different Sparky types. And in it, I came out as the scientist. So that's my primary Sparky type. And then I have a shadow Sparky type, which I think is called a Maven. I get confused between the names. And the Maven likes to learn and likes to gather knowledge. And the scientist likes to solve problems. Okay. And it was a light bulb moment for me because it meant that I was doing what I like, that tick the boxes in my entire career. That's what I did for my entire career, gathering data to solve marketing and sales problems, essentially. And how that's translated into what I do now. And it comes in fits and starts. So when I first started, I was like, how do I use data? How do I use people data? How do I address the gender pay gap? So I kind of get distracted, let's say, by some things. At the end of the day, it really boils down to how can you assess what is the missing piece in this? So if we have this framework, what are the areas that are most important to you? What are the areas that are not being met or that are maybe a lower score, let's say, as an individual or as an organization, because you can use it from both perspectives. And how do we close the gap of that? So again, it goes back to my entire career using databases where the data is already there. I'm analyzing data, I'm spotting opportunities, presenting back to clients. And now it's less about that hard data and more about the people data. and what's going on for people, which is a challenge for me because I like things that are quite concrete. I like the kind of accountancy, it's black or it's white. So this is a challenge for me, but I still love using those types of insights to help people to understand a little bit more about what they need to do differently in order to create those happier working environments. So hopefully that gives a flavour of how it's translated from a career and a lifetime of analysing data to, okay, now I have the opportunity to have an impact on people's working lives, which for me, if I think of problem solving and that being the core of what I do, the biggest problem that I see or that I personally experienced is that most people are not happy at work.
Interesting that you're talking about the people data, because that is so nuanced and so difficult to pin down, isn't it?
Yeah.
The one that always comes to mind when we're talking about those kind of people related surveys is the NHS survey, so the National Health Service in the UK. When you're working with organisations and they are looking for data-driven answers to a problem that maybe they don't even know what the problem is in a level of detail yet, what kind of challenges are they having, and how are they using that data to put those solutions in place?
The solution that I'm looking to build at the moment is, so at the start of this year, I was like, I want to take this and I want to turn it into a technology platform so that it's something that people can use themselves as an organization. They can use this, they can add it into their own people systems, if you like. Another time I had this idea that it would be like a centralized hub where people could come to and they could access tools and resources. And then there would be a host of consultants, let's say, that they could work with to drill into this very specific area. Because if you think about, I suppose, the breadth of happier at work and all of the different aspects, I can't talk to absolutely every single bit. I suppose for me and my perfectionist tendencies, I want to make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible. So that would require a team of associates to work on these different elements at the same time and deliver to that, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. What I'm seeing is that from a data perspective, so if we backtrack, say, a few years ago when I was like, oh, people data is where it's at, and that's what I'm going to help people with, and that's my background is with data and solving problems. What I found was that there are so many organizations who are just not using the data that they have. They have this wealth of data at their fingertips, but they don't know how to use it. And I imagine a lot of that is because people who work in HR didn't get into HR because they were particularly good at data and that they understand it. And what I'm finding is the people who work in HR that I have encountered are very process and policy driven, as opposed to being these whizzes with, okay, so we've identified this as an issue. How do we use the data that we have? Because they have tons of it to solve this problem. So I'm not seeing that there. I would imagine, and I'm sure you've got listeners all over the world, I will speak from an Ireland perspective because Ireland, I think the uptake on using HR and people data is very low. But from the UK, I think you're a little bit more advanced. And I would say the US and maybe other parts of Europe are a little bit ahead further than that.
Yeah, certainly workforce data and workforce analytics was certainly something that the NHS was very focused on. But again, I don't know if that is in terms of the very factual turnover, how many people do we have, what's the whole time equivalent, as opposed to the NHS survey, which is done, I think it's once a year, that will give you that, are people happy at work? Do they trust their managers? And I guess those are the really tricky questions and answers that people really need to work with.
Yeah, it's also just a point in time. This is the other thing to bear in mind. So if you've had a bad day at work, you might give a negative score to all of those. And so what I'm seeing emerging as well from a technology perspective is a lot of companies, and I mean service providers as opposed to the kind of companies or the HR themselves. So service providers emerging who are doing real-time type of stuff, who are doing more frequent touch points, like to the point that they could be doing it daily or they could be tracking it weekly or whatever it might be. So there's loads of different things available if you want to understand whether it's the sentiment, whether it is how people are feeling after a particular type of event and things like that. So there's the hard numbers that you were talking about, like the turnover and the cost of hire and the time to hire, all of those kinds of things that you're like, oh, we have to bring that down. And it's like, we don't really, like, why are you trying to bring it down? You need to understand the reason behind all of those things. But then there's like you say, the softer type of things and understanding, well, how are people feeling at any given time and what's driving that feeling of how they're feeling at work. And going back to this idea, is that I had a negative interaction with my manager? Is it coming to the end of year review and I didn't get the result that I wanted? Or did I have a compensation conversation and I'm not happy with the money, or whatever it might be? There are things that are always driving that. And I think if you can look at that over real time, and again, not my area of expertise to do all of those touch points. For me, it's more the holistic framework of how can we address all of these issues? How can you identify, well, which is the biggest driving factor of your organization or you as an individual to not either create this happier working environment or not feel a sense of happiness at work?
One of the things that I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you about is imposter syndrome. So I've heard you talking on other podcasts about imposter syndrome, and I have this theory that as people are more self-aware, they realize what they don't know, and we know that that's one of the elements of self-awareness, is suddenly you realize what you don't know. And I wonder whether that feeds imposter syndrome. And there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that, for me, it almost feels like the opposite of imposter syndrome. It's the less self-aware you are, the more you have this notion that you're highly competent, but actually the data suggests that the people who think they are highly competent are the ones who are least competent. So confidence and competence don't necessarily go hand in hand. And I'm wondering if the converse is true, if more self-awareness means that your confidence reduces and therefore imposter syndrome grows.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Well, that's something I always thought as well. So let's take a step back and talk about imposter syndrome and what it is. Like, for me, it's beyond self-doubt. So we all suffer from self-doubt. Imposter syndrome is this underlying fear that you're going to be found out as a fraud. So all of your deepest, darkest fears are going to come to light. You're going to be exposed either by yourself and your own incompetence, or be exposed by someone else who comes knocking at the door to say, hey, Aoife, you know how we gave you that amazing opportunity? Well, we made a huge mistake and you didn't deserve that at all. So that's what imposter syndrome is. And it's this fear. Now, what you're talking about in relation to self-awareness, that's what I always thought, that the more you know you don't know. Yeah. I think I've articulated that okay. But the more you know, the more you realize how much more there is to know. And in comparison to that, how little you know. So there's a couple of ways that you can think about this. You can think about this from the perspective that can exacerbate your fears, because suddenly, and maybe it depends on the type of imposter syndrome that you have. And Dr. Valerie Young has done some amazing work on the 5 different types. But let's take the expert type, for example. So if the expert type is the kind of person who feels like they have to have all the answers, they have to know everything about a subject before they can be called the expert or be referred to as the expert. And so if you're an expert type and you have, you suddenly become aware that, wow, there's all of this stuff that I didn't know. And now I know that there's a huge gap in my knowledge. And now I feel like a total fraud. I can't call myself an expert. I can't be seen as speaking on this topic because there's so much more that I don't know. And the reality is that we're never, ever going to know absolutely everything. What we tend to do, especially when we have imposter syndrome, is compare ourselves to other people. And we assume that along with the overlap of knowledge that we have with someone else, that they have this vast amount of knowledge that we are not aware of, and we discount the vast amount of knowledge that we have that they're not aware of. So there will be an overlap in our knowledge, but we compare ourselves and we think that we're falling short because we're comparing the overlap of knowledge with the vast amount of stuff that we don't know as well. There's another way to look at that also, that as you gain self-awareness, you have a greater appreciation of what your strengths are and what you bring to the table. And I think really, truly acknowledging that is a way to combat imposter syndrome. So really acknowledging yourself, building up your self-belief in the context that not everyone is going to know absolutely everything, and you are free to have an opinion on whatever topic it is that you want to talk about. It's free speech, but also maybe try having an informed opinion before you start talking about something. So for me, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. I'd be more inclined to agree with you that the more we know we don't know, the more that we can feel this sense of imposter syndrome, both from the expert type. And I'm also thinking, because I have a huge perfectionist tendency as well, that is another one of the imposter syndrome types. The perfectionist might want to make sure they get everything right, or they want to know the right course of action, for which they're going to need all of the possible information that's out there. And so, yeah, it could be something that exacerbates it. So the more you know you don't know, and the more you grow in awareness of yourself and the impact on others around you, then this could be something that is very triggering.
So if you think you are a sufferer of imposter syndrome, what do you do with that? How do you move away from it? How do you maybe learn to live with it?
Yeah. So the first thing I always say is the awareness piece. So you need to be aware that you are suffering from imposter syndrome. So oftentimes we can be aware that such a thing exists, but, oh, you don't get it. I really am an imposter. So the awareness that it could potentially be imposter syndrome, the acknowledgement that it is imposter syndrome that's driving the behaviors. And someone challenged me one time on LinkedIn a few years ago and said, why do you call it suffering? It doesn't have to be suffering from imposter syndrome. And my challenge back was, it doesn't have to be suffering from imposter syndrome, but if you're holding yourself back in some way, if you're doing something that impedes you getting what you want from life or achieving your goals or whatever it might be, then that is suffering, because you're not reaching your full potential. So first of all, again, I have a model around this, and I've always talked about the ABC. So A is for acknowledge that it is imposter syndrome, give it a name. And again, when I first started talking about imposter syndrome, people were like, I can't believe this is a thing and it has a name. I've been feeling like this for years, and I've been hiding it, and I've been keeping it a secret because I thought I was the only one. So just knowing that it is a thing and it has a name, I think is a great place to start. I talk about B then for belief. So build up your own self-belief. How do you do that? Is that getting feedback from other people? Is that doing some inner work on yourself to build up your belief? Is it keeping a folder of testimonials of lovely things that people have said? So when you've had a terrible day or got a rejection, you can refer back to that folder and you can, help yourself to feel a little bit better. And then I talk about C, which is courageous action, because people think that they need to feel confident in order to take action. But really what you need to do is commit to taking action. And when you make that committed action, so it might be one small step that you can identify. And for anyone who's listening today, think of one thing that you feel like imposter syndrome is holding you back from. And what's one small action that you can take? When you start taking those small actions and you're having a mild amount of success with that, it builds up your confidence to start taking bigger steps and more action. Now, I like to also reframe this idea. So we have this view that something is either a success or a failure. But what if you shifted that view that everything that you're on this journey And it's not success or failure or pass or fail. It's I'm on this journey and I've had a setback. And the setback on this journey is a learning opportunity for me. What will I do differently the next time? And then, so that's all about courageous action. I've recently added in kind of this bonus thing, because what I was realizing was people were getting in their own way and they weren't taking that action. And my bonus one, so there's A, B, C, and it's D, is do it anyway. So you feel like an imposter and you don't want to speak up in a meeting, do it anyway. You feel like you don't have the confidence to stand up on a stage and present, do it anyway. One of my past podcast guests, actually, I've seen her talking about this. I don't think we explicitly covered it on my podcast, but she was talking about these imposter feelings. And she talks about it from you can do this and you can also do this at the same time. So you can feel really uncomfortable while also having a difficult conversation. So just because you feel uncomfortable, just because you don't feel confident, doesn't mean that you can't still do those hard things that you think are hard. Just another, I suppose, slight aside or note to add on that, we often perceive other people as being really confident when actually internally we can't see how they're feeling. So maybe they're feeling really nervous, but they're not projecting that on the outside, because who wants to listen to someone who's projecting this image of being really nervous? But then when we are internalizing what's going on, we neglect to take into consideration how other people are feeling inside. So we might be feeling really nervous and we look around and think, wow, no one else is feeling nervous. That's because you can't see how they're feeling. So bear that in mind. I think that other people have these internalizations and they could be projecting this image, but actually you're the only person who can feel what's going on for you inside, and maybe they're feeling exactly the same way.
When you talked about your C and D, I was thinking of Susan Jeffers' book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I think
yes.
And it's absolutely that yes, you can be feeling awkward, but actually you step onto the stage anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you do need that courage to be able to do that.
Exactly.
So before you go, tell us a bit about your podcast, because it is hugely successful. How did it start? What brought you to the idea of podcasting, and where are you going to take it?
Yeah, really good question. So for me, why did I start? Because I love listening to podcasts. I will devour podcasts. And I love listening to yours. I love the insightful conversations that you have. I was listening to the one, and I can't remember the lady's name, but it was about incivility at work. And I was like, ding, ding, ding.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing. Like just incredible insights in that. So for me, because I love listening to podcasts, I had an idea and a microphone. I think I was midway through my master's at that stage. And I just thought, why not? And I'll do it. And I probably went in completely blind, had no idea, but I just did it. And I did all the editing myself and I did everything myself. And I found guests for the first few episodes just within my network. Like that's how you get started doing something. I think if I look back now and could give myself some advice, I'd probably do it quite differently. But at the time, it was just like, there weren't that many people doing podcasts. It was growing at the time, but then it really took off during the pandemic, I think. And I just kept at it. I love the conversations that I have with people. I love the people that it connects me with. It's not always easy. It takes up a huge amount of time in proportion to the reward I get for it, which is nothing. Clients do find me because of the podcast. I meet amazing people like yourself and other people, for collaborations and for conversations, which is amazing. But I pay to host the podcast. I pay to have the podcast edited, all of those things. In terms of the future, like there are some ideas that I have that I haven't executed yet necessarily. I constantly innovate on how I do things. So I've started using AI in the podcast, for example, to help me to write the show notes, to remind me of what are some of the key points that we talked about on the podcast episode, to do video clips. Like AI is incredible for the kinds of things that it can do at the moment. So that is, something that I will continue to do, is innovate how I do things. as a kind of a data nerd, I'd love to bring in more of the analytics and search engine optimization to make sure that people who are looking for the kind of content that I'm putting out there are able to find it in Google or YouTube or anything like that. It is available on YouTube as well, so that's something I've done. But I'm also toying with the idea of having other formats. So one recent thing that I did, I used to always have a synopsis at the end of every episode saying, and here's the key points and the takeaways. I've split that out. So now it's 2 episodes instead of 1. So if people want to listen just to the kind of highlights or the, here's the key actions, if they're taking their dog out for a walk for 10 or 15 minutes, they can listen to that episode. But another idea I had was answering listener questions. So in a 5-minute blast, tell me what your question is, and I'm going to answer that on the podcast and do it that type of format. Having said that, I will put a caveat and say it's, as I mentioned, an extraordinary amount of work to do what it is that I'm doing already. So in order to add an extra format, even though it would only be a 5-minute episode, it's still going to be another huge amount of work and headspace and all of that kind of thing to make that happen. So I don't know whether that will be the case. I will continue to do what I do as long as I'm getting that kind of positive acknowledgement and feedback from people who listen, because it is hard. And there are so many times where I'm like, I can't fit this in anymore. I just can't make it happen. From a headspace perspective, I would love to get so much more strategic about how I do things. So thinking into 2025, basing my episodes around the real questions that people are asking me right now, as opposed to, here's the guest that I have, here's the topic they're talking about, and just going with the flow, but really having that topic in mind before I have the conversation so that we really stay on track. Like the conversation can go anywhere, and that would be one of my strengths. But I want to come at it from the perspective of this is the question we're trying to answer, so we can explore all of these things so long as it answers this question.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm inspired. And I aspire to be as dedicated and as technical and as capable as you are on podcasts. The one thing I have done with AI recently, on episode 70, I used an AI voice as the introducer. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, because it was actually, I was interviewed by somebody else and it's only on YouTube, and it was such a good conversation. I've put it out as a podcast, as an audio podcast, but I put an intro with an AI voice, and I think it sounds okay. But listeners, tell me if you don't agree. But that's amazing.
I love that idea. Yeah.
It was good fun. Aoife, thank you so much for joining me. I have learned a lot. If listeners want to find out more about your 2 frameworks that you talked about, where is the best place they can go and find you?
LinkedIn tends to be where I am, and I'll spell my name because not everyone will be able to spell it. But if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, then go and check me out. So search for the Happier at Work podcast on whatever platform you're using. And I am Happier at Work HQ. I'm sure it'll be linked in the description anyway. Happier at Work HQ on YouTube. So go and follow along there. That will be linked to all of my various websites and social links. But LinkedIn is the place that I enjoy most and that I hang out most in. I am present on other platforms, let's say, but LinkedIn is my favorite, and it's the place I like the most and hang out the most. But my name is spelled Aoife, pronounced Aoife. So Aoife O'Brien. O'Brien is standard spelling. It's with an E. Some people get confused that it's with an A, but O'Brien with an E. So Aoife O'Brien on LinkedIn, and let me know where you found me as well. So mention Dr. Nia Thomas in your intro, in your connection request, and I look forward to connecting with you there.
We will indeed make sure that all of your links are in the show notes. So listeners, watchers, you can go and connect with Aoife. Thank you very much. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much. I've absolutely loved this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.